Welcome to the Life of Learning podcast. I'm Eustace Frank, and today I'd like to just have a bit of a continuation on the theme that I was talking about yesterday, which was about free agency. And this particularly came in response to a book that I've just recently read. I ended up actually reading two books by Daniel H. Pink. His first book was Drive, The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us, and then his second book, which I just recently read, was Free Agent Nation. And in my podcast yesterday, I mentioned that a big reason why people still choose to work in companies is that companies provide security. The company looks after them, after the person who is within the company. They give them security in response for the workers' loyalty, and the security is in the form of obviously like job security. It's difficult to be fired, and particularly in places like the United States, you get a lot of extra benefits from being part of the permanent staff. So it might be health insurance, or a range of other benefits that might come from that. And when people sort of think about loyalty, we tend to think about it as being loyal to some sort of organization, and this has kind of really become part of our mindset. But as I pointed out yesterday, we can't actually organizations aren't entities, and they can't actually care for us, and they can't look after us. And in fact, the loyalty that we expect from a company and that we try to show to a company isn't really real, to be honest. In fact, we can only show loyalty, real loyalty, from person to another person. And people who are free agents do actually still show loyalty, but exactly, they show it to people, not to organizations. And unfortunately, this move that society has of showing loyalty to organizations and collectives has meant that people move away from showing loyalty to the very people that are within their own households. And this becomes a big problem, especially in terms of this, what we often speak of as a work-life balance, and where people juggle going to a job, picking up kids from school or daycare, shuttling these kids to various types of activities, and then that person trying to be involved in the community in some sort of way, trying to connect with their spouse, juggling that as well, and then pursuing their own hobbies and interests. And often we really don't have time for each other. And you see this in so many people's lives, that this is just not working out. Families are coming apart, and we're becoming further frustrated in our jobs, and we've just been taught to basically separate work from leisure, and family also from work. And the separation of work and play has been actually developing for some time, and it's partly, I guess, come through the Industrial Revolution and some of the earlier revolutions in terms of economic revolutions that have happened throughout the last few centuries in particular. And for instance, in the 18th century, the school reformer Franke began to implement free time to children's school days, and this was to be in contrast with work time, and work time, of course, was very, very important part of particularly the Protestant work ethic. So Franke was a school reformer in Prussia, so in European Prussia in the 18th century. But in assigning a particular time as free time, so exactly, this is what we call our modern day sort of lunch time. So children will go out to lunch or break time or whatever it is. But in assigning this particular time, all it really did was reinforce that work and leisure were separate things and that cannot be combined. And as we moved into the 20th century in particular, it became really commonplace that a person would go to work, or that you would travel somewhere to do your job. And this thinking split the time between family time and work time, that they were very separate things. But I don't think this change has necessarily been good for families. Children, in particular, I see this, having been a school teacher, I see this, that children are no longer able to see their parents working, which in times past was actually a major source of inspiration for children, to see, not only to see their parents working, but they were able to also join in with their parents in terms of the work that they were doing. And yes, of course, this meant that often children would follow in the footsteps of their parents when it came to professions. Now, this still happens to some degree today, and of course there are also some fair criticisms to do with this. Obviously, I don't think it's necessarily good that exactly all children follow exactly in their parents' footsteps. And I think, we do need to give the freedom for children to explore beyond that. But at the end of the day, humans are most inspired by watching real people doing real things. And it's not surprising that children get very bored in school, as they are asked to live in this constantly abstract world. They're doing hypothetically meaningful things in response to hypothetical situations from hypothetical people, basically. This is what basically textbooks tend to be. And eventually, as human beings, we just want to do something that is actually real. And so seeing and being part of real work within a family is a far stronger motivation for learning. Tom Petzinger notes, the reunion of work and home is only a symptom of a much larger condition, the natural affinity of business and family. And, while we've tried to separate these two things, there is now a tendency, a growing understanding that, in fact, maybe we should be bringing these two things back together again. And in terms of, I talked to one person yesterday in terms of this whole integration of work and family, and this was a guy from Nepal who came to New Zealand originally to study IT, and he, after 2 years of studying IT, he just got increasingly bored by the whole thing, and then he eventually left that, and now he works he works in the scaffolding industry. So, and when I asked him, what he wants to do further, he said that his dream was actually to go back to Nepal and work in his father's construction business. That in a sense, his time in New Zealand had been a bit of a waste of time. Obviously, that experience of him, I guess, wasting some of his time here in New Zealand has brought to reality some of the importance of what family actually means to him and what the family business also means to him. Because he was involved in family business in growing up in the construction company that his father had or still has. And, he was, in his later years, he was even involved in the accounting for the family and all those sorts of things. So, his aim is to actually go back and work in the family business and then hopefully eventually take it over as well. So it's interesting what he thought initially, that he would go and off into a completely different direction from what he'd grown up with in terms of trying out IT, and maybe it was valuable that he tried that out, but eventually he came back to actually what I got bored of school, of university, and actually I love that experience of what I grew up with, and I want to be part of that again. And this is where he kind of feels, I guess, at home. So that was a really interesting story, and really interesting talking to this person. And what we've come to notice is that as more and more people become these free agents, where they're becoming more independent, they're becoming independent contractors is another word, or freelancers, we're returning to more naturally tribal ways of living, where we work, play, and learning, relationships are all blended into each other, and where loyalty, as I said before, becomes more personal again. Loyalty is not given to a company, organisation, school, or daycare. Often those sort of things we see them as being responsible for the care of members of our family, but rather we're moving back to this model where loyalty is given in a real way between human beings within the family. So instead of a mother trying to balance loyalty to a company with taking care of her children, and often you'll find that, in order to keep her job, her loyalty to the company actually needs to come first compared to her children. And so people are trying to move away from that now, or some people are at least, where their loyalty goes first to their family. So loyalty, for instance, to their children comes first, and then as a free agent, they're able to add work on top of that, in proportion to their priorities in life. So this obviously brings up the issue of education as well, within the family, and for children in particular. So in the United States, which is the country that is leading the way in terms of free agency, we have seen a massive rise in homeschooling, and furthermore also unschooling. Just to note, touch on unschooling. So unschooling, yes, it can be a bit of a confusing term, but really, if we just break it down, it just means that children are not schooled, and otherwise they're not put through the structures of school in their path of learning. And I'd like to label this, for the rest of this podcast, label it as free learning. So this movement towards free learning is increasingly a move for many people, not necessarily for religious reasons, but rather a possibility to pursue a more free agent way of living. And a great example of this I came across recently is the vlog post from the Norp family. You can see their YouTube channel if you search up the channel name Norp and South, and they've got an amazing blog, and while they are also a religious family, their main reasons for going this more free agent way of living is not so much to do because of their religious convictions, but rather because they wanted to become more free agents. And you can hear them talk about this on their channel. So free learning, children and families, they also do not have their timetables dictated to them by an organization, or like a school, or anything like that, but rather they work on their own schedule. So the company and organization models of the Industrial Revolution said that workers needed to all congregate in a certain place at a certain time to all do a similar sort of job, and schooling obviously also reflected this model, because that's the type of people that society wanted. So in schooling, children all meet at a certain place for a set amount of time, and they all do standardized work. And another correlation is also, or similarity, is that just as pay increases for employees that through audits and reviews to see if certain standards have been reached and all those sorts of things, and whether the employee has been a good employee. Also children were tested and examined to be rewarded with grades and certificates, as well as the approval of the school for having been a good student. So when it comes to talking about homeschooling or free learning, socialization is the biggest concern that people always come up with when it comes to this. So, and when we think about it, this is also a concern that adults have in regard to working as a free agent. They wonder if it can become very lonely. And there is a certain validness to this argument, in terms of, yes, you can, if you are working as a free agent or you are learning in terms of free learning, there is a tendency that you could end up isolating yourself. Not to say that you can't actually isolate yourself in a school either, but yeah. But, there's the thing that many free agents and entrepreneurs are actually finding new ways to connect and build networks with other people. And in a previous podcast, I talked about that Daniel Pink, the author of Free Agent Nation, puts forward the Hollywood model of working. So when people are creating a movie, there is not necessarily one company that directly employs everyone, but rather there are a number of free agents and small companies that come together for the project, and then they disband again afterwards. However, the network of connections they have made through the project then can play an important part in who they choose to work with in future projects. So the point is that instead of your social and professional circle being set and managed by the hierarchical structure of the organization that you work for, free agents seek to create their own personal network. So it's more, I guess, to people talking about it, it's more a sort of horizontal sort of outreach rather than a vertical outreach. So they create their own personal networks of people that they can work with and share ideas with. And this is similar to what is happening within the free learning model of learning for children as well. There's initiatives such as the massive open online courseware, or MOOCs, or MOOCs, MOOCs. Makerspaces, another awesome idea that's coming to the fore. Unschooling resource centers, and of course we also have our social networking sites. People are connecting in a variety of ways, and these ways are not just limited to the strict age segregated and isolated model of school. Particularly things like makerspaces, it's not just people there it's not just young people there, it's not just children there, it can be people from all ages, and that's kind of the beauty of it, that we no longer have this understanding that it's only children who have to learn, and it's children who we have to make learn, but in fact that we all can be learning, and we can be learning at all times in our life, and we can actually all come together to learn. So despite all the wonders that socialization at school is said to bestow on people, one aspect of life that has seemed to be declining is that of community. So the personal interactions with other people close to us. But possibly actually the sense of community is simply changing. And maybe a return to our homes rather than to our work sites and offices may be a way to revitalize community. While this may come across as more counterintuitive, greater independence and autonomy may actually be the way to foster better relationships with others. Being a free agent and more than a cog in the machine of an organization may actually provide us with the confidence we need to interact with other members of our community, and that we come to realize that we can be of value to our community, and that because other people's loyalty is also stronger towards their own family rather than towards a company, they'll also have more time to be able to reciprocate and add their own value to the community. So I also, as I started thinking about these things, I felt there was another thing that, now this is a wee prediction that I'm going to make, and I'm not sure yet. I'll need to think about this a bit more, but I feel that possibly there might be another reversal coming in regards to the Industrial Revolution trend, and that is, there's generally been a trend towards urbanization in response to the Industrial Revolution. But as people become more free agents, that urbanization drive no longer becomes quite as important. And free agents then seek to carve out their own life and focus on building their own communities with people that they can actually physically interact with, rather than simply wanting to fade into the mass of people within a city. So that's just an interesting aside that I was thinking of. And when it comes to community, again, I had a different conversation yesterday with another man, and at the moment in Japan, the Rugby World Cup is on. And of course, in New Zealand, we're very much still a rugby sort of nation. Now, unfortunately, New Zealand lost their semi-final. But this man told me an interesting story. He said that back in his hometown, a man had built from his balcony basically terraced seating down from the balcony down to the ground level. And then the neighbours next door, they'd had I believe it was some rugby posts, and then from the rugby posts they hung a big sheet, and then they set up a projector so that everybody could sit on this terraced seating and be able to watch the game on this big screen. And so this brought everybody in the neighborhood together, and they had a barbecue and all these sorts of things. And it was interesting, they said even people like firemen and policemen and all this sorts of thing happened to drop by and just have a cup of tea and everything. And it was very much a community building type of event. The man said, he got to know neighbors that he hadn't really talked to at all before. And this is just a fantastic, and it's a great story of how, obviously, like, in terms of, I think it's great that this Rugby World Cup has brought this community together and these neighbours together, and it's just a fantastic thing. He noticed that there weren't any complaints. The only complaint that he, or at least from anyone in the community directly, there were no complaints. The only complaint, he said, kind of a bit jokingly, was that one old man who lived across the street said that they needed to turn the sound up because he wasn't able to hear all the commentary just from sitting in his house. Of course, he could have actually gotten out and come across the street. But anyway, so yeah. But one issue that did come up was that he had to take this seating down, and that was because he hadn't had a permit to build this from the council. So, the council wasn't too pleased that he had done this thing, even though, it was a massive benefit to the community and so valuable to the neighborhood there. And this kind of brings me to my last issue, the fact that there will be a pushback. We will see a pushback against the strengthening of families and communities through free agency. The strengthening of families and communities is not really in the interest of corporations or governments and councils. As people become less reliant on external benevolence to look after them, government institutions and corporations will become an irrelevant annoyance. However, human beings, they're not keen to let go of power and control that they have over other people. And so one of the things that usually comes in place in regards to this is that we might see more regulation and control being put in place. And I'm just going to sneak this wee aside in here as well, is that I'm always astounded as to how many people believe that more regulation harms big corporations. Yes, of course, it makes life slightly more complicated for them. But on the whole, it actually does the opposite in terms of it doesn't harm the big corporations, because more regulation just raises compliancy costs, which at the end of the day harms the smaller competitors more than it does for the big corporations. So smaller companies have a bigger hurdle to overcome, while the big corporations, they're able to comply with the compliancy standards and costs and all those sorts of things, and that just reinforces their monopoly. So one thing that's been interesting for me, obviously I live in a tiny house, so and we've got this here in New Zealand and elsewhere around the world, we've got this growing tiny house movement, and this is mainly because, particularly here in New Zealand, a house on wheel kind of slips past a lot of the regulatory requirements, and so this makes tiny houses a lot cheaper. And tiny houses then are a way of people increasing their freedom. And over the last year or so, there's been increasing pressure for regulations and standards to come into place. And exactly, these will inevitably then raise the cost of building tiny houses, which will again then make it harder for people to reach that state of freedom for themselves. Yet despite all these pushbacks, I do believe that people will push on towards freedom, and we are just wired as human beings to try and gain this autonomy within ourselves and for ourselves, and this desire to become free, and that will allow us to endure some pretty significant hardships along the way as we strive towards this goal. So I hope that more of us can start embracing this trend toward free agency, start making a move towards this direction, this way of living, where loyalty does become more personal, and where we start seeing a strengthening of our families and our communities. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope to see you in the next podcast. All right. Thank you so much. Bye.